let's talk about prepositions. Now, I know what you're thinking. We've already talked about prepositions in several previous videos. Yes, that's true, but we've always talked about prepositions as they relate to some other specific point of German syntax or grammar. We've never had an episode specifically on prepositions. We talked about prepositions as they relate to case in the 4-part series that we did on German cases last year, and we talked about them again as they relate to relative pronouns and relative sentence clauses in the video that we did on that subject this year, and we've mentioned them here and there in other videos, but we've never had a video specifically to talk about prepositions, and I think that's overdue. So let's do that now. It does mean that some of the content in this video is going to be a rehash or a review of stuff that we've already covered. But wait. Before you click away, I know that you might not want to watch a video that's just a review of stuff that we've already covered. That's fair, I understand. But before you go, maybe skip ahead to this time code because we're going to cover a very important cautionary note about using prepositions across languages. So before you go, maybe check that out first. Okay. If you're still here, I assume that means that either you have not watched those videos that I referenced earlier, or you actually want to do a review of prepositions. That's great, because I do too. I would happily stay out here all afternoon talking about prepositions. So let's get into it. What is a preposition? A preposition is a word, or words, as we'll see, that describe the relationship between two persons, places, or things in the same sentence. Now, generally speaking, prepositions will serve one of 4 main purposes. Number 1, you can describe the location of something. For example, I'm riding on a motorcycle. That person is driving in a car. These people are talking inside of a building. Okay, great. Number 2, we can discuss the direction or the motion of something. For example, I'm riding from home. She's flying from Alberta to Ontario next week. Okay, great. Number 3, we can describe the time at which something is happening. For example, I'll call you at 8 o'clock, or I'll see you on Saturday, or we'll do that in February. Okay. And finally, number 4, you can discuss the manner in which something is happening. For example, they left without me. He's writing a letter with a pen. Okay. Great. Now, prepositions are usually a single word, but not always. In English, there's a small number of prepositions that are composed of multiple words. For example, because of, or on account of, or in spite of, or outside of, or inside of. Even though they're composed of multiple words, they are still treated as a single logical unit of language within the sentence, so it doesn't make much difference. Now, some terminology to get out of the way. The preposition has an object upon which it acts directly. This object is referred to rather unimaginatively as the object of the preposition. And the combination of the preposition and the object upon which it acts are referred to as the prepositional phrase. Now, I will draw attention to the prefix pre at the start of the word preposition. I know it's pronounced preposition, but you can think of it literally as preposition. Pre is short for preceding, meaning coming before. And historically, prepositions in English come before the object of the preposition, usually immediately before. But in modern English, we've got a problem. The problem is something called a dangling preposition. This is something that used to be considered a mistake in historical English, but over time, because it's been used so many times by so many people, it's kind of become acceptable English. And in fact, in modern English, you'll see and hear this everywhere. So for example, who are you buying that motorcycle from? Okay, from is the preposition there. What is the object of the preposition? You might be tempted to think that it's that motorcycle, because it's in the object part of the sentence. But no, it isn't. The object of the preposition there is the word who, even though the word who and the word from are separated by literally that entire sentence. The prepositional phrase there is not easy to spot, because it's cut into 2 chunks and the 2 chunks are separated. If you want to get around that, you can rephrase this the way it would be phrased in historical English. From whom are you buying that motorcycle? That sounds very stuffy and old-fashioned in modern English, but it is formally correct. And now we can more clearly see that prepositional phrase. The preposition is from, and the object of the preposition is whom. Notice it's whom and not who. Why? Because technically, who is a subject pronoun, not an object pronoun. We need an object pronoun to make that sound right. But, I mean, in modern English, nobody cares. The word whom is more or less obsolete, and the word who is very often used as a substitute for the word whom. So in modern English, who are you buying that motorcycle from means the same thing, even if it does make the prepositional phrase kind of hard to pick out of the sentence. Now, there's a good news, bad news situation when it comes to prepositions. And funnily enough, both the good news and the bad news apply to both of the languages that we're going to look at today, English and German. The good news is that prepositions themselves are immune to declension. Declension is when a word changes form depending on how it's used in a sentence, changes either spelling or pronunciation. Prepositions don't do that, which is nice. Take any preposition in English, for example, the word with. It is always spelled that way, it is always pronounced that way. It never changes spelling or pronunciation depending on how it's used, which is nice. But having said that, I mean, it comes with a little asterisk. The object of the preposition must be expressed in the correct case. For example, in English, you would never say, that gift is for I. That's wrong. But why is it wrong? It's wrong, again, because I is a subject pronoun, and what we need there is an object pronoun. That gift is for me. Okay. That's about as complicated as it gets in English, so we're pretty lucky on that count. It does get crazy complicated when we look at German, but let's save that for later. So that's the good news. What's the bad news? The bad news is that prepositions in both languages are crazy arbitrary. Certain prepositions go with certain objects, and if you pick the wrong preposition, you will either say something that sounds like gibberish, or worse, you will say something that is technically grammatically correct, but which does not mean what you intended to say. This can be bad. Let's look at some examples. In English, you can see someone at a party, or in a car, or on TV, but you never see someone at TV, or on a car, or in a party. Let's pick one of those. Let's say I saw Heinrich last week on a car. If I say that, it sounds like something crazy was happening. Heinrich was on the car, like he was on top of the car? What was going on there? No, what I meant was he's in the car, inside of the car. But if I switch the object of the preposition from car to, let's say, bus, I could say perfectly correctly in English, I saw Heinrich last week on a bus, even though he was not on the roof of the bus. I mean to say that he was inside of the bus. But why do we say on a bus but in a car? I don't know. It's just arbitrary. If someone who does not speak this language natively asked you that question, why do we say on a bus but in a car, what would you say to them? You might be able to ad-lib some kind of explanation like, oh, well, it's historical, dates back to naval terminology, like we get on board a boat. And in modern times, we use that terminology for larger vehicles, and we use in for smaller vehicles. I don't know if that's true or not, I'm just making that up. Or you could just honestly say, that's just how it is. That's just how we say that in English. That's not a great answer, but that's true. They're arbitrary. Prepositions are arbitrary. So if you pick the wrong one, it can sound crazy. Let's look at some more examples. Let's look at time specifiers. I'll call you at 8 o'clock, or I'll see you on Saturday, or we'll do that in February. If you mix those up, it sounds crazy. I'll call you in 8 o'clock. We'll do that at February. It sounds like, okay, either you're really having a hard time with the language, or are you okay? Are you having a stroke? Should I call a doctor? And worse, sometimes if you pick the wrong preposition by accident, it can change the meaning of the sentence. This is bad because it's not obvious that you made a mistake. You might have meant to say that. For example, I'm looking for something. I'm looking at something. I'm looking into something. Those are all perfectly correct English language sentences, but they all mean different things. The only difference there in those sentences is the preposition that we used. If you pick the wrong preposition by accident, it can change the meaning of the sentence. If I say I'm looking for something, it implies that I don't know where it is. I have to find it. If I say I'm looking at something, it implies that I'm standing right in front of it. It's right here. I know exactly where it is. So it's important to pick the correct preposition to match the context in question. So how does this compare to German? The first thing we'll notice is that in German there's no such thing as a dangling preposition. As far as I know, that's a uniquely English phenomenon. So, okay, does that mean that the preposition always comes immediately before the object of the preposition in German? Well, sort of, not really. German has a small number of postpositions. As the name implies, these come after their object. There's not very many of these. For example, zuwider. Er handelte seinen Befehlen zuwider. He acted contrary to his orders. Notice that in English, contrary to comes before his orders, but in German it comes after because it's a postposition. Okay, there's also what they call adpositions. These ones can come either before their object or after them, and annoyingly, these can change in meaning or in case, depending on whether you put them before or after the object. Far and away the most annoying one, in my opinion, is entlang. It means along. It can go before the object, in which case you use genitive case. So for example, viele Menschen stehen entlang des Flusses. A lot of people are standing along the river. It's entlang des Flusses because we're in genitive case. But if you use entlang as a postposition, then it takes accusative case. So for example, geht die Straße entlang. Literally, he walks the street along. That's not how you would say that in English. He walks along the street. But notice that we switch now to accusative case because entlang is in the postposition position. But the exception to that is if you use entlang in conjunction with an, then you switch to dative case. So, geht an dem Bach or am Bach entlang. He walks along the creek. There we're using dative case because entlang is being used with an. Oh boy, okay. Another one is durch. It can go before or after. So, wirf den Ball durch das Fenster. Throw the ball through that window. Okay. You can also use durch after the object, as in, arbeitet den ganzen Tag durch. He worked the whole day long. Notice that even in English, long comes after the object. Okay. Postpositions and adpositions are a little bit wonky. I don't want to spend too much time on them other than to mention that, yes, they exist. You should be aware of them. But in this episode, let's stick to prepositions because we've got enough to talk about as it is. Now, we've got the same good news, bad news situation in German as we had in English. The good news is that prepositions themselves are immune to declension. That means they don't change spelling or pronunciation depending on how you use the prepositional phrase within the sentence as a whole. Okay, great. So take any preposition, let's say mit. It's always spelled that way, it's always pronounced that way. That's nice. But this comes with the same little asterisk, the same little caveat that we had in English, which is that the object of the preposition must be expressed in the correct case. Now this is handled differently in German than it is in English. In English we express the object of the preposition in the objective case because it's an object. Okay. In German, the case that we use with the object of the preposition is going to vary depending on the preposition. The preposition drives that case. So we have 4 types of prepositions in German, and you think to yourself, oh, okay, there's 4 cases in the German language. So does that mean that there's one type of preposition for each of the 4 cases in German? Well, no, not quite. As far as I know, there's no such thing as nominative prepositions in German, so we can ignore the nominative case for this discussion. There is such a thing as an accusative preposition. There's a list of prepositions that will express their object in the accusative case always. So for example, für, it means for. Dieses Geschenk ist für mich. This gift is for me. You wouldn't say in German, dieses Geschenk ist für ich, nominative case, similar to how in English you wouldn't say this gift is for I, because that's a subject pronoun and we need an object pronoun. But in German, we need an object pronoun there for a different reason. In German, we need to use an accusative object there because the preposition für demands an accusative object, not because of how we're using this in the sentence, not because of where the prepositional phrase appears in the sentence, but rather because of the preposition that we're using. So you wouldn't say, dieses Geschenk ist für ich, nominative, that's wrong. You wouldn't say, dieses Geschenk ist für mir, dative, that's also wrong. It's dieses Geschenk ist für mich because of für. One of the wonky exceptions to this is the preposition bis, which is technically an accusative preposition. And you can use it on its own. So, for example, bis später, a common expression in German that means until later. Okay. You can also say something like, wir sind von 8 bis 5 geöffnet. We're open from 8 until 5. Okay. Accusative case there for bis. But bis is commonly used in conjunction with the dative preposition zu, as in the expression bis zum nächsten Mal, which you might have heard a few times on this channel. It means until next time. But zum or zu dem nächsten Mal is dative case. Why are we using dative case if bis is an accusative preposition? Well, it's because we're using bis followed immediately by zu. And zu is a dative preposition. And that's a nice segue to the next type of preposition in German, which are dative prepositions. These prepositions will always express their object in the dative case. A very common one is mit. It means with. So, ich rede mit meinen Eltern. I'm speaking with my parents. You wouldn't say, ich rede mit meine Eltern, accusative case, because mit demands the dative case. Another one is von. Was willst du von mir? What do you want from me? You wouldn't say, was willst du von mich? Because von, again, demands the dative case. Now, if it was always that clear cut, we wouldn't have a problem here. If there was one type of preposition for each of the 4 cases in German, you would just have to memorize those 4 lists and we'd be done. It wouldn't be too difficult. Unfortunately, the road gets a little bit bumpy from here on out, so let's keep going. Let's look at genitive prepositions. Yes, there are prepositions in German that require a genitive object, but you may recall if you watched the episode that we did on the genitive case in German, the genitive case in German is slowly dying out and being replaced by the dative case. So it's very common in modern German, especially in the spoken language, to hear these so-called genitive prepositions being used instead with a dative object. So for example, I had to cancel my ticket because of the storm. Ich musste meine Fahrkarte wegen des Sturms stornieren. Okay, that is technically correct. That is genitive case. You would be perfectly well understood if you said that. But in spoken German, in modern German, it's much more common to hear wegen dem Sturm, dative. And in fact, if you fast forward another, 50 years or so, there might not be a genitive case in German anymore. It might have been completely supplanted by then by the dative case. The wonky exception here is any preposition that ends with halb or seit must be expressed with genitive case. You cannot use dative as a stand-in there. Why are these ones special? I don't really know. But for example, es existiert nicht innerhalb dieses Bezirks. It does not exist within this district. You wouldn't get away there with saying innerhalb diesem Bezirk, dative case. That's wrong because that preposition ends with halb, therefore it requires genitive case always. Okay, so what's the 4th type of preposition in German then? Well, buckle up because this is where the road gets really bumpy. The 4th type of preposition in German are called bidirectional prepositions. These ones can take either an accusative object or a dative object depending on what you mean. This gets really tricky and this is really confusing when you're coming from English to German for the first time and you see these prepositions sometimes with an accusative object and other times with a dative object and you can't figure out what the pattern is. Here's the general rule. If you are describing something that is changing locations, you use accusative case with these prepositions. If you are describing something that is not changing locations, then you use the dative case. That's confusing. Let's look at some examples. Ich gehe in dem Gebäude or ich gehe im Gebäude. Ich gehe in das Gebäude or ich gehe ins Gebäude. These both translate to English as I'm walking in the building, but they mean different things. Accusative case in German implies a change of location. In English, we would add the directional adjective. Directional adjective. Why do I keep saying that? Directional preposition. You would add the directional preposition to. I'm walking into the building. It means I'm entering the building. Whereas in German, if you use the dative case, it means that I'm not changing locations. I'm already in the building. In English, you might say I'm walking around inside of the building. This is subtle, but it's very important. It's important because if you pick the wrong preposition, you can end up with a sentence that is still grammatically correct, but which does not mean what you intended to say. This is a bad mistake because it's not obvious that you made a mistake. You might have meant to say that. Another example. Wir bewegen die Waren auf das Schiff. Wir bewegen die Waren auf dem Schiff. These both translate to English as we're moving the cargo on the ship, but again, they mean different things. Accusative case implies a change of location. We're moving the cargo onto the ship. The cargo wasn't already there. Whereas if you use dative case, there's no change of location. The cargo is already on board the ship. So in English, you might say, we're in the cargo hold of the ship and we're rearranging cargo inside of the ship. The cargo is neither entering the ship nor leaving the ship. Okay, this is tricky. In English, we have to add additional words to the sentence to express either motion or lack of motion, or change of location or lack of change of location. Whereas in German, they can switch cases to achieve the same effect. This means we have to be very attentive to what it is that we're saying when we use these bidirectional prepositions. And this gets a little bit worse because that rule about changing locations is not always literal. Sometimes it's figurative. For example, I think about in German would be ich denke an. Literally, I think on. So ich denke an blank, where blank is whatever. An is bidirectional. So we've got two options for case. For whatever blank is, we could express it in the accusative case if there's motion or change of location involved, or we could express it in the dative case if there's no change of location happening. Which do we use here? What would you use for blank there? If I want to say I'm thinking about the mountains. Okay, nothing is changing location there, so it seems like it should be dative case. Ich denke an den Bergen, but that's wrong. For whatever reason, it's ich denke an die Berge, accusative case. But why? Nothing's changing location there. The only thing I can think of is that my thoughts figuratively are leaving my head and going figuratively to the mountains. I guess that's kind of a hackneyed explanation, but that's the best I can do. I don't really know why. Similar thing with the verb for to remember. It's sich erinnern. Notice that it's reflexive. So if you want to say I remember blank, in German it would be ich erinnere mich an blank. Again, we see an. Literally, I remember myself on. That's not how you say it in English, but that is how they say it in German. So ich erinnere mich an blank. What case do we use for blank? There's nothing changing location, so you might expect again that it should be dative case. If I want to say I remember her, you might think it should be ich erinnere mich an ihr. Dative case for her, but it isn't. Again, it's accusative case, and I don't know why. I guess figuratively my memories are traveling back in time. I don't really know. So it's ich erinnere mich an sie, accusative case. So sometimes this is kind of fuzzy. The rule there is not always terribly useful. Sometimes you just have to memorize special cases, I guess. So there you go. Bidirectional prepositions can be very tricky, and it's very important to nail this down. So I recommend a lot of practice and repetition on this area. It does slowly start to sink in and make sense over time, but it'll take a while to get there if you're new to this. Okay, let's briefly talk about prepositional contractions. This doesn't really exist in English, but if a preposition is used with an article frequently enough, they can get smushed together in German to form a contracted version of the two words. So these are usually pretty intuitive. You should be able to spot them and recognize them when you see them. For example, an das is contracted to ans, in dem is contracted to im, zu der is contracted to zur, etc., etc. Notice, if you're new to German, notice that when they contract two words, they don't stick an apostrophe in there to let you know where letters were removed. They just smush the words together, which is kind of confusing, but it is what it is. Now, prepositions can serve the same four basic purposes in German as they can in English. That is to describe the location of something, to describe the direction or motion of something, to describe the time in which something is happening, or to describe the manner in which something is happening. Let's take a look at these with examples. Describing the location of something in German. Let's start with an easy one. In. Very, very similar to English. Ich bin in der Bibliothek. Ich bin in dem or im Rathaus. I'm in the library. I'm in the city hall. Okay. Be careful, remember to use dative case with in. In is bidirectional, and we're not describing something that is changing locations here, so we use dative case for these. For certain other places, you will use an instead of in. For example, a train station is a Bahnhof. So you don't say ich bin in dem or im Bahnhof, you say ich bin an dem or am Bahnhof. You can also, instead of using an, you can use by, but it doesn't mean exactly the same thing. I think it's a little bit more vague. You can say ich bin bei dem Bahnhof or ich bin beim Bahnhof. Maybe I'm not right in the train station, but I'm very close to it. You can also use by with the name of a person if you're at their house. So ich bin bei Heinrich, for example, would mean that I'm at Heinrich's house. In English you just say at, but in German you use bei. You can also use by for a named business. For example, arbeitet bei Walmart. He works at, again in English you'd say at, but or I guess you could say for in English as well. He works for Walmart or he works at Walmart. In German you use by. He arbeitet bei Walmart. Okay. There's one kind of wonky special case, and that's for islands. In English, you can say I'm in Hawaii. Hawaii's an island, or a chain of islands, I guess. In German, you use auf if you're talking about an island. So, ich bin auf einer Insel. I'm on an island. I guess we do the same in English if it's not a named island. If you just want to say I'm on an island, in English, it's the same thing. I'm on an island. Okay. Okay, let's move on to prepositions of motion, describing the motion or direction of something. This is very tricky in German because there's a bunch of them, and they're pretty arbitrary, just like in English. So, if you're traveling to a country, you typically use nach. Nach literally means after, but in reference to traveling, it means to in English. So, ich fliege nach Deutschland. I'm flying to Germany. Ich reise nach Canada. I'm traveling to Canada. Okay, the exception to this is if the country name contains a definite article. There's a small number of countries, like die Schweiz is how they say Switzerland, literally the Swiss, or the United States of America, die USA in German. There you don't use nach to describe traveling to that country, you use in. So ich reise in die Schweiz. I'm traveling to Switzerland. Ich reise or ich fliege in die USA. I'm flying to the United States of America. Okay, notice that we use accusative case there because there's a change of location. I'm going to there. Again, with the bidirectional prepositions, we gotta watch that. Now, if you're walking or driving somewhere, you can use either zu or in, depending on what you mean. This gets really tricky. Let's say, ich gehe zum Einkaufszentrum. I'm going to the mall. This implies, at least I think, that you're going to the mall without the intention of going inside the mall. Like I'm walking there to meet someone outside the mall and then we're going to go somewhere else. We're not actually going into the mall. That's just where we're meeting. If you're going to the mall with the intention of going inside to buy something, then you would say, ich gehe ins Einkaufszentrum. But having said that, some places will always use zu. For example, I'm going to the library. You say, ich gehe zur Bibliothek. Wait a minute. That looks like dative case, but you just said that if we're changing locations, we have to use accusative case. Yes, very good catch. But zu is not a bidirectional preposition. That rule about changing location only applies to the bidirectional prepositions. Zu is a dative preposition, so it always takes dative case regardless of whether or not you're changing locations. Yes, I know this is confusing, but keep going because it will make sense eventually. All right, now it gets a little weird. If you're going to a very specific place, you don't use zu or in, but rather an. Literally, an means on, so I don't really get this one. But if you're going somewhere very specific, or you're going somewhere where you can stand on it or next to it, I know this is really arbitrary, but you use an. For example, ich gehe ans Mikrofon. I'm going on the microphone. Okay, ich gehe an die Bushaltestelle. I'm going to the bus stop. Literally, I'm going on the bus stop. Okay, I'm going to the border would be ich gehe an die Grenze. Why? Why isn't it ich gehe zu der Grenze? Well, I can stand on a border. So we say an. What? Yes. I'm going to the river. Ich gehe an den Fluss. But I can't stand on a river. Why do we use an for that one? Well, I guess it's because you can stand next to the river. Therefore, we use an there instead of zu. Yeah, I know. It's crazy weird. All right, let's move on to prepositions of time. We want to describe the time at which something happens. This, just like English, again, is crazy arbitrary. In German, you will use am or an dem if you're describing a specific day or if you're describing a specific date. For example, wir treffen uns am Samstag. We'll meet on Saturday. Or wir machen das am 1. Juni. We'll do that on the 1st of June. Okay. If you're talking about a specific time of day, you won't use am, but rather So, ich rufe dich 8 Uhr an. I'll call you at 8 o'clock. Wir treffen uns Mittag. We'll meet at noon. Okay. There's another word you can use here if you want to be a little bit vague. If you don't want to mention a specific time, but rather an approximate time, you can use gegen. This is weird because gegen literally means against, but in the context of telling time, it means something more like around. So, können wir uns gegen 8 Uhr treffen? Can we meet around 8 o'clock? If you're describing a month or a season, you don't use am or but rather im. That's literally in dem. So, wir machen das im Juni. We'll do that in June. Or, wir sehen uns im Frühling. We'll see each other in the spring. Okay. Now, the oddball exception here is years. If you're describing a specific year, for whatever reason, the Germans don't seem to use prepositions with years. So, for example, sie wurde 1950 geboren. Sie ist 2010 gestorben. She was born in English you'd use the word in, 1950. She died in 2010. In German, they don't use a preposition at all there, which is kind of odd. Okay, let's look at something called a prepositional adverb. What is that? Well, similar to the prepositional contractions that we looked at earlier, these are combined words that are very handy to know. They can make your German much more economical and sound much more natural at the same time. Now, just like in English, you can combine a preposition with a pronoun. For example, this gift is for him. I'm going with her. Okay, great. But in German, you can only do this if the pronoun refers to a person. Dieses Geschenk ist für ihn. Ich gehe mit ihr. Okay. So far, so good. If you're referring to an inanimate object, however, the Germans prefer to use these prepositional adverbs as a short form. So, for example, if you wanted to say, what are you doing with that? In German, you might be tempted to translate that literally word for word from English. Was machst du mit das? I guess mit is dative, so you would say, was machst du mit dem? Okay, I don't think I've ever heard a German person say it that way because there's a prepositional adverb you can use instead. What you do is you take da, you stick it as a prefix onto the preposition. So you could say, was machst du damit? It means the same thing. What are you doing with that? Damit is with that. Damit sounds like an English swear word, but it isn't. It's a linguistic coincidence that it just happens to sound like that. So there's a bunch of these words, and it's very handy to get to know them. The tricky part for using them is that if the preposition in question starts with a vowel, you have to stick the letter R in between da and the preposition for phonetic consistency. This is similar to what we do with the indefinite article in English, where you use a if the following word starts with a consonant, or you use an if the following word starts with a vowel. So a truck, an elephant. Okay, similar thing happens here for the same reason, phonetic consistency, and also to disambiguate. For example, an is a preposition. If I want to say da an, that sounds kind of clunky. You've got that glottal stop in the middle, or you could just remove that and pronounce it as one syllable, dan. But there's already a word in German, dan. This would be confusing. So if you want to say da an, you stick an R in between. You say daran. That looks like a completely different word, and I guess it is, but it literally means an that. So I'm thinking about it, or I'm thinking about that in German would be, instead of saying ich denke an das, you would say ich denke daran. This sounds much more natural when you're speaking German. Another one that you might have heard on this channel is lass uns darüber reden. Darüber is literally let's talk about that. When you talk about something in German, you literally talk over it. Lass uns darüber reden. You can also sometimes use hier and wo as prefixes, the same way you use da. This, I think in the case of here, is a little bit formal. Maybe you can say something like, hiermit beenden wir diese Veranstaltung. Hiermit, I think in English, the closest equivalent would be hereby, but that's rarely used in English. That would mean hereby, we hereby close this event. Some other ones you might hear, ich weiß nichts davon. I don't know anything about that. Or ich habe nichts damit zu tun. I have nothing to do with that. These are very handy words, and they're used quite a lot in German, so you do well to learn these and practice them. All right, let's talk about an important cautionary note that you should be aware of when you're using prepositions across languages. We've seen in the examples throughout this episode that prepositions in both languages are crazy arbitrary. There's often no rhyme or reason why should we use this preposition instead of that preposition. It is the way that it is. It's not a satisfying answer, but that's just how it is. Here's the really bad news about that, is that the prepositions that we use in one language don't always match the prepositions that they use in another language for the same expression. This is crazy confusing. If you've watched this whole episode, you've already seen and probably already noticed a few examples of that here and there. There's a bunch of these across English and German, and if you try to translate something literally from one language to another and you pick the wrong preposition, either you're going to say something that sounds kind of strange, or you're going to say something that sounds like complete gibberish, or you're going to say something that is technically grammatically correct, but which does not mean what you intended to say. This is tricky, and we have to pay close attention to this. So, some of the many, many examples, I can't list them all here, but let's go through a few of them. In English, something is on TV. In German, you say, es ist im Fernsehen. Literally, it's in TV. I like the German one better because the image you're looking at is inside the TV, right? So, I mean, on TV implies that it's like on top of the TV, but no, it's not the same. In English, you could say he lives with his girlfriend. In German, it's bei. Wohnt bei seiner Freundin. Literally, he lives by his girlfriend, but that in English would imply that he lives next door to his girlfriend. Nope, that's not what we're saying. We have to be careful here. In English, you can die of something. He died of old age. In German, it's an. Starb an Altersschwäche. He died on old age, literally, but that's not how we would say it in English. That sounds like nonsense in English. In English, you can be afraid of something. I'm afraid of women. I don't know, that's a crazy example, but ich habe Angst vor Frauen in German. Vor could mean in front of, but that, what does that mean? Don't try to translate it literally. We have to adjust the prepositions that we use as we move from one language to the other. In English, you can be allergic to something. In German, you're literally allergic against something. They use gegen. Er ist allergisch gegen Nüsse. He's allergic to nuts. And worse, sometimes there are examples where a preposition is required in one language, but not in the other. For example, in English, we look for something. We need that preposition for. If you just say, I'm looking something, that's nonsense in English. That means nothing. You have to have that preposition there. I'm looking for something. Okay, in German, ich suche etwas. In English, I can say, I remember her. There's no preposition there, none needed in English, but in German, you need one. Ich erinnere mich an sie. Literally, I remind myself on her. That, again, means nothing in English, but we have to adjust when we move from one language to another. Otherwise, we're going to end up confusing ourselves and whoever's listening to us. So there it is, prepositions in English and German. They are crazy arbitrary in both languages, and in many cases you just kind of have to memorize which preposition goes with which object. And yes, you're going to get this wrong a bunch of times. I've been studying German for years and I still get this wrong on a regular basis. It's embarrassing. Hopefully most of the time your mistake will be minor enough that your meaning will still be understood. But we have to be careful, especially with the bidirectional prepositions. I will stress that one more time before we close this episode. Those bidirectional prepositions can be very tricky in German. That's all for today. We will see you next time on Lernen und Fahren.